So before we can talk about the development of the skin, bones, and muscles, I think it's well worth taking a look at what the final structures look like, the mature skin, the mature bone, the mature muscle. I think that'll make a lot more sense when we're going through how they develop if you know how they're supposed to end up. So to start off with, your skin is actually part of what's called the integumentary system, which is the skin plus all of the accessory structures, hairs, glands, etc. Skin is really an organ in its own right, and it's one of your largest. In fact, it's one of the few organs you can see in your body without any sort of special assistance or surgery. It makes up about 16% of an adult's body weight, and it has a surface area of anywhere from 16 to 21 square feet, so it's really quite large. It has a number of functions. It's a protective organ, so it protects you from trauma, from exposures to things like UV rays, chemicals, radiation, other things in the environment, and from microbes. It is a first line of your immune system. In terms of exposures, when you think about sun exposure, it's in fact UV exposure that produces damage to the cellular structure of the skin that then leads to wrinkling. So while it is a protective organ, it is not perfect, and some things, of course, do get through. It is, of course, critical for temperature regulation. Can you imagine how you would regulate your body temperature without skin? It helps you retain moisture, and it's an incredible sensory organ for both touch, pressure, and pain. It comes in 3 layers, the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis, and we're going to talk about each here in a row. The epidermis is the most superficial layer of skin, or the one that's on the surface, closest to the surface. And within itself, it has 4 to 5 epithelial layers, depending on where it's located. So in order from most superficial or surface to the deepest layers, you have the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, and the stratum lucidum is the extra layer you have on the palms of your hands and soles of your feet, a little extra protection in very high contact areas. Then the stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. And the stratum basale has a lot going on there because it attaches to the basal lamina, which then attaches to the dermis via structures called dermal papilla. So the basal lamina is responsible for holding the top layer of skin to the next layer, and it does that through these projections that come from the dermis into the stratum basale, so into the lowest layer of the epidermis, which then sort of creates a connection and interlocking. It helps hold the layers together. It's also responsible for the formation of your fingerprints and the other fine lines in your skin. So not wrinkles, but the lines that were there when you were born. There are many different types of cells within the epidermis. Keratinocytes are some of the most interesting. They produce the keratin protein, which helps keep your skin stiff and yet also water resistant. And most of the cells in the skin are keratinocytes. In the stratum basale, the keratinocytes are actively dividing, which is the only part of the epidermis that has actively dividing cells. But as then they progress up towards the surface, they stop dividing, their structure changes, and by the time they get to the stratum corneum, they are in fact dead, which is why you're shedding dead skin cells from the surface of your skin all the time. Also within the epidermis, we have Langerhans cells, which are immune, who serve an immune function. And then in the stratum basale, we do have actively dividing keratinocytes. We have Merkel cells, which are neuron receptors. They're important to your sense of touch and pressure. Melanocytes, which we'll talk about in more detail, but those are your pigment cells, also responsible for the color of your hair and your skin, UV protection. And then we also have desmosomes, which are a type of cell-to-cell membrane junction. They're part of what holds your skin together, essentially. They also make your epidermis watertight. Now, your epidermis is avascular. There are no blood vessels running through the epidermis. And those are all the layers. Okay. Next up is the dermis. Now, the dermis only has 2 layers, the papillary layer, which is where the dermal papillae are that are connecting it to the epidermis above, and then a reticular layer, which contains collagen and elastin. Those are 2 proteins that are critical to the function of the skin. The collagen provides structure and strength to the skin. The elastin is about flexibility. It makes it possible for you to move. Skin must be very strong and also quite flexible. Also in the dermis, you get blood and lymph vessels, which again you don't get in the epidermis. You see nerves. You see hair follicles, which will grow up through the epidermis, but the follicle themselves are in the dermis. And then you get sweat glands and other kinds of glands. Now, the hypodermis is what connects the skin to the underlying bone and muscle, so another very important structure. It's composed largely of both connective tissue and adipose tissue, adipose meaning fat. It's one of your primary reserves of fat storage, so it's a place where fat can be broken down when you need it, which makes it an energy reserve. It also provides a great deal of insulation and a cushioning effect. Now, to look back at skin and hair color, of course, there's a great deal of variation in human skin colors, even among families. And the pictures you're seeing there are all from the same family. The two girls on the right are twins, clearly not identical twins, but they come from a family with multiple different ethnic backgrounds, and they both got sort of a different shake genetically. So you can see a lot of variation in skin color there. Now, skin pigmentation is primarily determined by melanocytes, which produce melanin. It's a protein that the eumelanin in its normal form that produces sort of black and brown tones, and it's the quantity that determines the color of your skin. Darker skin is greater melanin production. Interestingly, you get increased production of melanin from UV ray damage, which is a tan, and that's protective for the DNA, which can be damaged by UV rays. There's also pheomelanin, which is responsible for sort of yellowish and red tones. There are two other primary sources of skin coloring, although not as important as melanin. There's keratin, which produces a yellow color and is usually actually pathologic. It's usually a sign there's a problem. You can get it from dietary issues. So, for example, if you ate nothing but carrots, has a lot of keratin in it, it would produce a yellow color. It can be caused by liver disease. Also, hemoglobin can tint or color your skin, and that's because of the way that it carries oxygen. So hemoglobin is the protein complex at the middle of your red blood cells that holds on to oxygen. When it contains oxygen, your blood is sort of pinkish or reddish. When it doesn't have oxygen or it's low on oxygen, it's bluer. And that's why babies that have heart defects that are affecting the circulation of blood around their system and consequently oxygen around their system have a bluish tint to their skin. It's because they have more deoxygenated blood. Now, genetics of pigmentation. That's tricky. We don't really understand it. It's a very complex trait. There are many different genes involved, but I thought I'd highlight two of the players just because it's kind of interesting. The first is the MC1R gene. Now, MC1R is the gene that makes the red hair phenotype. It's a melanocyte cell surface receptor molecule, so it affects the way that melanocytes interact with other cells. It produces this phenotype of reddish hair, very pale skin with freckling, and an increased risk for melanoma, which is a cancer that originates from melanocytes. So these are people who don't tan as well, they don't produce as much black-brown pigment, consequently their DNA is not as protected from UV damage, and they're more likely to have mutations that could lead to cancer. Related to MC1R is OCA2. Now, this gene produces what's called the P protein, which is expressed in melanocytes, and it affects the production of melanin in both the skin and the retina. So your eye color is also determined by melanin production. Now, variants in the OCA2 gene can regulate eye color, and it produces this spectrum of anywhere from blue to brown. But mutations, deleterious mutations in OCA2 produce oculocutaneous albinism type 2. And as you can tell from the word, it affects both the eyes and the skin, as it would since the P protein is expressed in both the eyes and the skin. And what you get is essentially the absence of melanin production, producing very pale hair and skin and reddish eyes. Now, interestingly, OCA2 modifies the MC1R gene. So if you have the blue eye color variants in OCA2, you're more likely to show freckling related to MC1R, which is why fair-skinned people are likely to freckle.